Jasmine Cole barely noticed as she stepped out of the gas station convenience store, scrolling through her phone in one hand and clutching a bottle of soda in the other. It was just a quick stop to break up the long drive home with her dad. Anthony Reed was checking his watch, already thinking about dinner, when everything changed in a flash. She barely recognized the man until she bumped into him with a simple touch of the shoulder, nothing more. But his response was immediate. "Watch your step," a voice barked. Jasmine looked up at the stern face of Officer Greg Mathis. He was in his 40s, with big arms, a square jaw, and the kind of posture that suggested he believed he owned whatever position he was in. His hand hovered near his waist, near his holstered gun. "Excuse me," Jasmine muttered, taking a step back. But the situation didn't ease. His eyes locked on her as if she were a problem to be solved. "Is that your attitude?" Mathis's voice sharpened. Jasmine hesitated, remembering all the silent lessons she'd learned over the years that cops like this didn't like hesitation. She kept her voice even. "No, sir. Don't disrespect me," he barked. Mathis exhaled sharply, his eyes narrowing as if searching for an excuse to escalate. "What's in your bag?" Jasmine blinked. "Excuse me. Are you deaf?" he growled. "I said empty your bag." Her stomach clenched. "I just left the store. I have a receipt." "I didn't ask for your receipt. Empty your bag." Anthony, still near the car, turned at the sound of the loud voice. He saw Jasmine immediately, saw the tension in her shoulders, the way things were going wrong. Then Mathis acted. He reached forward and grabbed Jasmine's arm. The soda bottle fell and shattered on the sidewalk as she instinctively recoiled. "Don't fight," Mathis snapped. "I won't," Jasmine began, but the words had barely left her mouth when his fist came down. The blow knocked her off balance, sending her sprawling onto the sidewalk. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then Anthony Reed's voice cut through the silence. "Enough." Mathis turned, but whatever he was about to say died in his throat when he saw the man approaching. Anthony wasn't just Jasmine's father. He was the town's newly appointed sheriff. Anthony stepped out of the car, closing the door with a resolute click. The mothers standing nearby didn't even glance at him, completely indifferent to his presence. But Anthony didn't care, his eyes locked on Jasmine, who was standing not far away. "You stole," a cold voice said, causing Jasmine's face to contort in frustration. "I just told you to watch your tone," she said, but she was quickly cut off by one of the mothers. Despite the chaos, Anthony's voice now had a strange, dangerous appeal that turned small things into big consequences. Anthony took a step forward, his voice firm. "She didn't steal." Mathers still wouldn't look at him. "Sir, I'm asking your daughter to comply with a legal order." Anthony's patience was running out. "That's not a legal order, that's harassment." Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "I have a receipt," she said, reaching into her coat. But it happened so fast that before she could pull her hand away, a fist flew. The sound of bone hitting skin was deafening. Jasmine hit the pavement hard, the fall sending a wave of silence across the parking lot. The soda bottle rolled from her hand, spilling liquid onto the pavement. Someone gasped, and in the distance, a woman's voice trembled, "Oh my God." Jasmine's mind reeled, a dull buzzing filling her ears, drowning out all other sounds. Pain shot through her jaw, and the taste of blood spread across her tongue. Time seemed to stand still. Then Anthony's voice broke the silence, "Put your hands behind your back." The mothers stood there, smirks on their faces as if they were completely oblivious to Jasmine lying on the ground. Anthony reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge, and held it up. Mathers's face changed instantly when he recognized him as the new sheriff. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted, but Anthony knew, this was far from over. Mathers froze for the first time, his smirk twitching. As if his brain were trying to process what he had just done. The gas station parking lot, once filled with the soft murmurs of passers-by and the whine of the fuel pumps, was now completely silent. The weight of dozens of camera phones capturing the moment weighed down on him, but Anthony stood firm. His badge glinted in the afternoon sun, his grip too loose for someone who had just tipped the balance of power. But his voice, when he spoke, carried an unwavering authority. "Back up," Anthony said. Matthews swallowed. "Sir, I said back up." There was no shouting. No antics. Just cold, sharp words cutting through the thick, stifling air. Matthews's eyes darted around the parking lot, desperately searching for support, an ally, a way out. But his patrol car remained empty. Bystanders, phones raised, watched silently. No one seemed to intervene on his behalf. Jasmine remained on the ground, propped up on one elbow, her chapped and swollen lips trembling. Her eyes were wide with shock and pain, staring at her father. She had never seen him like this, not angry, not moved. Just, determined. Matthews's breathing was labored, his hands twitching at his sides, his fingers curling. "Chief. Let's talk." Anthony moved. In one smooth motion, he grabbed Matthews's wrists, turned him around, and forced his hands behind his back just as Matthews had done to so many others before. Same grip. Same pressure. Same lack of hesitation. Matthews spluttered. "That's ridiculous. You assaulted a minor," Anthony said, his voice even. "And now you're going to know what happens next." The handcuffs snapped shut with a snap. The last sound before the crowd broke the silence. A ripple of voices rippled through the audience. Someone cheered. Another muttered, "It's about time." And finally, Jasmine stood up. She slowed her steps, her face burning not just from the blow but from the sheer humiliation. Blood was streaming from the corner of her mouth, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, staring at the red stain. Her father turned to her, his eyes softening a little. Jasmine, her best friend, looked like she wanted to say anything, but her throat was too tight. All she could manage was a weak nod. Anthony turned back to the officers, his voice low but firm. "You want to explain why you hit my daughter?" The officer's face twisted into a mocking smile, his previous confidence gone. "I think she was reaching for something." "Reaching for what?" Anthony's voice responded, the words razor sharp. "A gun? A weapon? Or just a receipt?" Officer Mather's jaw tightened. "I acted in the interest of safety." Anthony stepped closer, his voice lowering so only Mathers could hear. "And whose safety was at stake?" "Yours." From a 17-year-old girl reaching into her pocket? Silence. Mathers exhaled through his nose, his hands adjusting the cuffs. "Done?" Anthony asked. Mathers laughed dryly, bitterly, as if he still thought he had a card to play. "Come on, boss. We don't have to do this here. Let's go inside." Anthony let the words hang between them for a beat before leaning down, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're not going anywhere." Mathers swallowed. Anthony straightened and looked out at the crowd. His phone was out, his face expectant. He knew how this would work, how quickly the city would react, how quickly the police department would come running. The story had spread across the parking lot. But the real fight was just beginning. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, thick and tense like the sky before a storm. Mathers stood there, his hands cuffed behind his back, the cold steel cutting into his skin. His breathing was shallow and uneven, the sound of a man realizing his luck had finally run out. Anthony tightened his grip on the handcuffs, feeling the slight resistance in Mathers's arms. It wasn't over yet. Anthony's body tensed like a coiled spring, not from direct combat but from the pressure of the moment. It was a strange reversal of power. For years Mathers had always stood above everyone, using intimidation as his weapon. But now he was just another man in handcuffs, unsure of how to handle it. Anthony's voice was low and steady, but each word carried the weight of something undeniable. "You are under arrest for assault on a minor." Mathers jerked in his arms. This was a mistake. Anthony ignored him. "You have the right to remain silent." Mathers' face twisted. "Come on, you really will. You have the right to a lawyer. If you can't afford a lawyer, the court will appoint one for you." Mathers almost choked. "Jesus Christ." His voice cracked, and for the first time, fear was evident in his eyes. Anthony kept his gaze steady, not breaking eye contact, his grip on his hand not loosening. There was no favoritism here. The crowd grew larger, more people gathering, moving closer but keeping a safe distance. Some held up their phones to record, some whispered to each other, some just watched the moment. In the front row, a man shook his head. "All these years, this guy's treated everyone like shit." Next to him, a woman folded her arms. "Guess he finally got the wrong guy." Jasmine leaned against the car, pressing a cold bottle of soda against the side of her swollen face. Every time she swallowed, her lips stung, but she didn't think about the pain. She thought about everything that had led up to this moment. She'd seen videos like this of black men and women handcuffed, pinned to the ground, abused. She grew up with the rules: keep your hands visible, don't talk back, be polite, don't give them an excuse. She followed them all. And she still got punched. Her father glanced at her, his eyes searching for something unsaid. She knew what he was asking. "Are you okay? Not just physically." She swallowed and nodded, but they both knew the answer wasn't that simple. She wasn't holding back because she was okay, but because she refused to give the mothers any power over her anymore. Anthony turned back to his officers, his department now taking him over. 2 cops came in and grabbed Mathers by the arms. His jaw was clenched, his face red with anger and shame. "You're making a fucking mistake," he muttered under his breath as they led him to a patrol car. Anthony didn't answer, because he knew the truth. The only mistake was letting this go. Mathers' radio crackled as he was shoved into the back seat, and the patrol car door slammed shut, the final punctuation of his demise. But Anthony knew better than to think it was over, because the real fight wasn't about one bad cop, it was about what happened next. The station was buzzing by the time Anthony and Jasmine arrived. The officers stood in hushed groups, some glancing at him with wide eyes, others avoiding his gaze altogether. It was one thing to hear about what had happened, another to see one of them dragged through the door in handcuffs. Mathers sat in the booking area, his face tight with barely contained rage. He hadn't said much since being shoved into the patrol car, but his silence was louder than his words. Anthony could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Some of the officers had worked with Mathers for years, and some probably agreed with him. They were waiting to see what kind of leader Anthony would be, and he wasn't going to keep them guessing. He walked toward the reception desk, where Lopez, a younger officer, sat looking between him and Mathers, as if he were caught in a situation that was more than he could handle. "Lopez," Anthony said, his voice calm but firm. Lopez hesitated, glancing at the other officers. "Chief, are you sure we are?" Anthony cut him off with a look. "Do your job." Lopez swallowed and nodded, pushing the necessary papers forward. Mathers glared at Anthony, but Anthony did not flinch. Because this was only the beginning. Anthony stood silently in the interrogation room, his eyes following Mathers' every move, sitting across from him. Mathers' face showed no fear, even a hint of defiance. When his fingerprints were taken, the corners of Mathers' mouth lifted into a haughty smile. "You think this will keep me?" he asked. Anthony didn't answer. He knew all too well how things usually worked. Mather wasn't worried about the charges against him, he was betting on the system. He believed that his connections and alliances would protect him, that the department would hesitate to take action against someone like him. He believed that public opinion would quickly fade away. But Anthony wasn't about to let that happen. Jasmine stood near the door, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes watching everything. The bruise on her cheek stood out in the fluorescent lights, a stark reminder of why they were here. Occasionally she caught the eyes of a few of the officers, who were looking at her not with concern, but with curiosity. A black girl like her rarely showed up at a police station other than as a suspect. But this time, she was a witness. The door to the waiting room opened, and Anthony didn't have to turn to see who had entered. Mayor James Calloway strode in, the look of a man who hated surprises. His suit was immaculately pressed, his hair neatly combed, but the tension in his eyes said it all. He didn't want to be here. "We need to talk," Calloway said. Anthony nodded. "My office." They walked down the hall, through whispers, into a room where the walls would have no ears. As soon as the door closed, Calloway's politeness fell. "Do you know how many calls I've had today?" he said, his voice thick with irritation. Anthony leaned against the edge of his desk, his voice calm. "Let me guess. Half of me wants Mather fired immediately, and the other half wants me gone." Calloway sighed heavily. "You know how the system works. The department protects itself. You think just because you have a badge, you can come in here and start doing things like this without consequences?" Anthony's face remained expressionless. "He hit my daughter," Calloway said quietly, his voice hesitant. Anthony leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "And you're asking me if I regret arresting him?" Anthony stood silently in the interrogation room, his eyes following Mather's every move, sitting across from him. Mather's face showed no fear, even a hint of defiance. When his fingerprints were taken, the corners of Mather's mouth lifted into a haughty smile. "You think this will keep me?" he asked. Anthony didn't answer. He knew all too well how things usually worked. Mather wasn't worried about the charges against him, he was betting on the system. He believed that his connections and alliances would protect him, that the department would hesitate to take action against someone like him. He believed that public opinion would quickly fade away. But Anthony wasn't about to let that happen. Jasmine stood near the door, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes watching everything. The bruise on her cheek stood out in the fluorescent lights, a stark reminder of why they were here. Occasionally she caught the eyes of a few of the officers, who were looking at her not with concern, but with curiosity. A black girl like her rarely showed up at a police station other than as a suspect. But this time, she was a witness. The door to the waiting room opened, and Anthony didn't have to turn to see who had entered. Mayor James Calloway strode in, the look of a man who hated surprises. His suit was immaculately pressed, his hair neatly combed, but the tension in his eyes said it all. He didn't want to be here. "We need to talk," Calloway said. Anthony nodded. "My office." They walked down the hall, through whispers, into a room where the walls would have no ears. As soon as the door closed, Calloway's politeness fell. "Do you know how many calls I've had today?" he said, his voice thick with irritation. Anthony leaned against the edge of his desk, his voice calm. "Let me guess. Half of me wants Mather fired immediately, and the other half wants me gone." Calloway sighed heavily. "You know how the system works. The department protects itself. You think just because you have a badge, you can come in here and start doing things like this without consequences?" Anthony's face remained expressionless. "He hit my daughter," Calloway said quietly, his voice hesitant. Anthony leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "And you're asking me if I regret arresting him?" Calloway shook his head, rubbing his temples. "The union's involved. His attorney has spoken out about excessive force and false arrest. And don't think about it for a second," Anthony crossed his arms, his voice sharp. "The media won't twist this into anything else." "They can twist it any way they want," Calloway countered, but his eyes wavered. "The video speaks for itself. The mayor sighed, looking out the office window. This town doesn't like change, Anthony. Anthony returned his gaze, unflinching. Then it's about to get nasty. Calloway stared at him for a long moment, assessing him, testing his resolve. Then he exhaled and nodded slowly. Okay, he muttered. Let's see where this goes. But Anthony already knew where it was going. Straight through the heart of a system that wasn't ready for someone like him. The next morning, the town woke up to unmissable headlines: Chief arrests cop for attacking teen. Gas station incident sparks outrage, calls for police reforms grow. The video had gone viral overnight. News stations had picked it up. Social media had ripped into it, exposing his history and record of every complaint ever filed against him, never once getting stuck. But this time, the floodgates were open. Jasmine sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. Her name wasn't in the article, but she knew they were talking about her. She was the teen victim. Black teen assaulted by police. She took a deep breath and locked the screen. This was crazy. Across from her, Anthony took a sip of coffee, the morning paper folded on the table. He didn't laugh, because he knew what was coming next: pushback. People who would say it was just a matter of doing your job. People who would make Jasmine the problem instead of the victim. They always did. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen before answering, his voice neutral. The deputy's voice was tense. Sheriff Mathers posted bail and was released. Anthony had predicted this. Mathers had too many connections, too many people willing to throw money at the problem if it meant keeping things quiet. But this time, things wouldn't stay quiet. Mathers's deputy was hesitant, and now he was threatening to sue. Anthony almost laughed. Of course Mathers would play the victim the moment the tables were turned. Jasmine tightened her hoodie sleeves, her voice shaking with disbelief. Are you serious? Anthony nodded slowly, rubbing his temples. Yes, he is. The lawsuit is just a tactic, a desperate attempt to divert the conversation from what Mathers did. But it won't hold. The video evidence is too clear. Still, this is going to be a fight, and it was never just about Mathers. The police union had gotten involved, calling Mathers' arrest an overreaction. Some officers in the department had begun to pick sides. The mayor was trying to play diplomacy, trying to keep things from getting out of hand. But Anthony wasn't here to play politics. He was here to fix a system that had been broken long before he arrived and that was making a lot of people uncomfortable. Jasmine studied Anthony for a long moment, then asked, "Are they going to push you out?" Anthony sighed. "They'll try. But I'm not leaving." His eyes met hers, unwavering. Not a chance. Because Mathers isn't just a bad cop, he's a symptom of a bigger problem. And I'm just getting started. The backlash was swift: threats, smear campaigns to discredit Anthony. The system's familiar playbook whenever anyone dared to challenge it. Some officers kept quiet, while others publicly backed Mathers. That didn't surprise Anthony. What did surprise him was how loud the town had become. Protests erupted outside police headquarters not just against Mathers, but against all the officers who protected people like him. People were tired. Tired of the endless loops, tired of hearing the same old stories. Anthony leaned against the window of his office, looking down at the cheering crowd below. Somewhere in the sea of people was Jasmine. He didn't stop her from leaving, because she deserved to be there. The door to his office opened, and Mayor Calloway walked in without warning. "You made this bigger than it needed to be." His voice was dry. Anthony turned slowly, raising an eyebrow. "I made it bigger." Calloway sighed, rubbing his forehead wearily. "You could have handled this differently. Otherwise?" Anthony repeated, his voice flat, but with a hint of edge. "How mothers get wrapped up and left like it never happened. How people stay silent in the face of injustice." Calloway didn't answer, just stood there, helpless. Anthony stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. You think this is about me? I could lose my job tomorrow, but this isn't going to stop. People aren't going to stand for silence anymore. They're tired. Calloway stroked his graying hair, his voice dropping. The police union is putting pressure on. They want things to go back to the way they were. Anthony chuckled, shaking his head. That's not going to happen. They have powerful people backing them. Good, because I do. He turned back to the window, looking down at the crowd chanting a name, Jasmine Cole. She was no longer a nameless victim, no longer a forgotten maiden. Her name rang out loud, clear. She had fallen, but she had gotten back up. Like this town. And Anthony had. Calloway rubbed his temples, his voice dropping. You really won't back down? Anthony turned, his eyes determined. Not now. Not ever. If this town is going to change, someone has to lead the way. And I'm ready.